Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. This is the third installment of our build-up to the history of the founding of the United States of America. Last time, we looked at the situation that developed between Spain and the breakaway Dutch Netherlands, who had been a part of the larger Spanish holdings on the European continent. This was a massive geography that included parts of modern Spain, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland. And as we closed out our time, the narrative focused on William of Orange, the Dutch hero, and his marriage to Louise de Coligny, whose father had been a powerful, influential French leader just a few years before. We also briefly touched on the disastrous help that the Dutch received by the French Duke of Anjou. The discussion of these men offers a good segue to turn our attention toward France for just a little while. They had a lot of things going on, both internally and externally, as well at this time. So as a bit of a recap, if you remember, William of Orange, or William the Silent, had a successful career serving two Spanish kings prior to his leadership role in the Netherlands in the service of Philip II. But later he emerged as the leader of the Dutch resistance until he was assassinated in 1584. Now you remember, William's wife Charlotte had not survived the first attempt on his life 2 years earlier. She had died of exhaustion caring for William about 2 months after the assassination attempt. And it was about a year later, in April of 1583, that William married his fourth and final wife, Louise de Coligny. And again, she's not just a Protestant. She's French, she's a Huguenot, but she's also the daughter of the former French leader, Gaspard de Coligny, who again had been a very important man in French society just a few years earlier. So to get a fuller picture of France at the time of the Dutch Revolution, it might be a good idea to back up and get a kind of a running start. I mean, they had so many internal issues about this time themselves. They were fighting foreign wars as well as 8 civil wars that are remembered collectively as the French Wars of Religion. And this was an atmosphere that will invariably find itself transferred to the frontier of North America in just a few decades. So to begin then, we want to start with the reign of Francis I. He actually reigned from 1515 to 1549. And it was during these years that the trouble started. Now, Francis was Catholic. I mean, pretty much they all were back then. But Protestant entered France through Lutheranism. And you know, there's differences between the various Protestant groups, as well as Catholicism. Most of those differences are around the communion table, the bread and the wine, and justification, how one is made right with God. It was later that the Calvinists grew in numbers, and they are those Protestants who became known as the Huguenots. Now, this was not a poor man's escapade. From early on, important men like Louis Bourbon were counted among the Protestant ranks. Louis Bourbon as in the Bourbon dynasty. Francis was anti-Protestant, but he was restrained for many years. He tried to find common ground for a long time, as any good administrator or bureaucrat in these situations would do. But this pacifism emboldened the Protestants, and their numbers grew, and their voices became louder. The flashpoint came in 1534 in what's been remembered as the Affair of the Placards. And this was a very serious matter, so serious that it forced John Calvin himself to flee the country. Now, as we've said, the majority Catholic France had been restrained in their response to the Reformed movement sweeping across Europe. But the Protestants overplayed their hand. I mean, in hindsight, it was all going to come to a boil anyways, but in my opinion, the Protestants definitely overplayed their hand. They began to place placards all over the place, bashing Catholic doctrine. It was not received well. These actions forced Francis's hand, and so suppression was on its way. Francis had no choice. But the Protestants were going to defend themselves. And so suppression was on the way, but so was conflict, and ultimately civil war. Now, understand, like in England, Protestantism in France made its inroads with the aristocratic crowd, the leaders, civil leaders, military leaders, men of standing, men of importance and rank and wealth, men that are not easy to subdue. And the rise of two influential and competing groups, with a third existing almost by default, began to emerge. So I'm going to oversimplify this a little bit for our model to help us to kind of navigate what's going on. And I will give you a warning that there's going to be some soapbox issues that we deal with, but I think it's imperative to get the right feel to begin to understand. So there's going to be a few related tangents that not only address the immediate narrative that we're working through, but also highlight how I kind of look at things. I mean, even if I don't bring some of these things up again, this is a little glimpse into how my brain works, right? My blueprint for working through the founding of the United States. Because the founders of the United States of America, they too were men who challenged the status quo. They're the ones who pushed back until it broke. So let's meet the contestants in a general sense that we're going to be talking about as we work through the events happening in France. The first group that we want to look at then is the House of Bourbon. Now, they're more like moderates or Protestant sympathizers at the least, who would ultimately replace the House of Valois and sit men on the throne for a very long time. It's an established family at this time who would ultimately rule for hundreds of years. The Bourbons were coming hard and fast. Their competitors were the House of Guise. These are staunch Catholics, less than moderate. They're a doctrine of Catholicism first, not necessarily status. Now again, I'm going out on a little bit of a limb here. This is how I've correlated this in my own mind. The House of Guise, they would eventually spearhead what came to be known as the Holy League. This is an ultra-Catholic movement funded and supported by Philip II of Spain. He's playing kind of the part of a foreign provocateur. Philip was a meddler of internal French affairs. I mean, who likes foreign intervention? I mean, seriously, that's not a rhetorical question. What kind of a person, what motivation is there to commit treason? Is the invitation of foreign intervention treasonous in and of itself? I mean, by what standard does intervening become treason? History is littered with the corpses of invited guests and their hosts, by the way. And there are several reasons why legally you could see intervention being necessary, as well as moral. It's a very slippery and fluid slope. It's a tough debate. There's civil rivalry, genocide, cultural, societal relations. It's very much the opposite, the antithesis of the mentality of the Dutch after Antwerp during the Spanish Fury. I mean, here's the question. What is it to be patriotic? Is unquestionable loyalty synonymous with patriotism? Are there universal humanitarian standards that we're all supposed to adhere to? And whose standards are they? I mean, who sets those standards? Aren't there real differences between some cultures? I mean, how do we react in the face of cultural pressure and change? Should cultural change be slow and careful, or if need be, should it be swift, carrying the masses with it? I mean, can patriots disagree? Can two diametrically opposed positions both be patriotic? Do you believe in the nation state? These are some of the questions that I find myself asking when I read of civil and political unrest. These questions demand either complete dismissal or they tend to gnaw at your conscience. They eat away at you until you have fully measured the impact of the situation at hand. I like predictability. I feel predictability makes me stable. And I always have an active conscience. I'm curious. I've changed just enough of my views in my own life over the years to realize that I may not have a handle on some things, even things that are habitual, chronic activities or sentiments. So in the wake of social or political pressure, this can cause an uneasiness. But I think that's a good thing. It means that I'm open to work through an unanticipated situation with some measure of sobriety. The point that I'm making, the point that I want us to keep in mind as we work through the situation in France at this time, is that throughout my own life, probably throughout your life as well, if you've thought about this, I've changed my views on a lot of things. Sometimes changes come very rapidly. But in each of these situations, as I reflect back later, I realize that my previous position, even though I've now dismissed it, was held with an honest conviction, with a sincerity, meaning I wasn't intentionally, quote unquote, wrong before. And so we have to give ourselves and others that latitude in most issues. I'm always thankful for those people who have had patience with me as I work through some situation, right? The question always comes down to when does patience and diplomacy end and action begin? Now, I'm about to date and label myself to an extent. There's an old song, well, it's an old song to me. It was when I was younger, from my youth, that's always resonated with me. You know, music is a powerful medium. It doesn't just convey the thoughts of the artist, it connects with the listener, and it can influence even the casual listener. So I want to read these lyrics. I thought about singing them, but you don't want me to do that. But I want to read the lyrics. And this is from a song by Charlie Daniels that came out in 1980, I believe, 1979, 1980. And it was at the height of the Cold War, and Iran had American hostages, and America still was reeling from the chaos and the turmoil of the 60s and the Vietnam War. And, you know, we were a nation that was almost adrift. And so I want to read these lyrics. And again, they might be a little antiquated, and they may be a little corny if you don't like stump jumping country music. But we're going to kind of flesh out some of the sentiment that's being conveyed here. So this is Charlie Daniels. The song is called In America. Well, the eagle's been flying slow and the flag's been flying low, and a lot of people saying that America's fixing to fall. Well, speaking just for me and some people from Tennessee, we've got a thing or two to tell you all. This lady may have stumbled, but she ain't never fell. And if the Russians don't believe that, they can all go straight to hell. We're going to put her feet back on the path of righteousness, and then God bless America again. And then the chorus. And you never did think that it ever would happen again in America, did you? You never did think that we'd ever get together again. We damn sure fooled you. Yeah, we're walking real proud and we're talking real loud again in America. You never did think that it ever would happen again. From the Sound up in Long Island out to San Francisco Bay, and everything that's in between them is our own. And we may have done a little bit of fighting amongst ourselves, but you outside people best leave us alone, because we'll all stick together, and you can take that to the bank. That's the cowboys and the hippies and the rebels and the Yanks. You just go and lay your hand on a Pittsburgh Steeler fan, and I think you're going to finally understand. And you never did think that it ever would happen again in America, did you? You never did think that we'd ever get together again. We damn sure fooled you. Yeah, we're walking real proud and we're talking real loud again in America. You never did think that it ever would happen again. There's an emotional sentiment that's being conveyed in this song. Blood is thicker than water. Proximity and familiarity trump commonality to a point. Like the domestic violence call answered by an officer of the law, sometimes the greatest danger or risk is actually posed by the victim, right? They show up to protect somebody getting thumped on by, let's say, their husband, and when they take the husband into custody, the wife attacks the cop. I mean, maybe the idea of national unity is a farce, right? Maybe it's just pie in the sky. Maybe it's naive to think that large people groups can actually coexist together in peace. Maybe it used to be that way. I mean, maybe it still is. It's hard to say anymore, but the nostalgic optimist in me wants to believe that it can be possible. Like after 9/11, when we all became just Americans again. Differences and debate, even hostile debate, can be healthy. That's how we learn and grow and create a better union. So here's some more questions. What are your most sacred views? How are they challenged? Have you listened to the other side of the argument? I didn't ask if you conveyed your point of view. I mean, we're all very good at that. That's assumed. Is there room for unity and diversity? Are your beliefs, which one of your beliefs are the hill to die on? Are your views constant? I know that I've been all over the boards on a lot of issues, and each time I felt like I was arguing from a position of strength. It's only when that position is challenged that I actually entertain the idea of reevaluation. I mean, listening and considering is not the same thing as capitulation, nor is it a signal that you have to change, but that you're careful with your opinions, that you're measured. Most situations have predictable outcomes. Most systems or isms have been tried and documented many times over. So likewise, the uprising or public challenge of the minority view often relies on and requires temperance on the part of the majority. If the majority engages too quickly or too aggressively, it can end very badly. We tend to consider those arguments closest to our own core values. In a general sense, individualism versus the fraternal brotherhood of all mankind, or private property versus communalism. And the reality of studying history is that this emotional sentiment, the unity of the masses, is largely contrived. It represents a way people want things to be. They organize their lives around the principle that they're in that way. Like when the Dutch rallied around their countrymen in response to the destruction at Antwerp during the Spanish Fury. You remember? The unity that they fostered did not last. Oftentimes, the unity that we see in a society isn't really there at all. Often there's an undertow of discontent or disenfranchisement that lies just below the surface, from one group or position to another. And it can be almost unrecognizable, even to the host, until division comes. Societal storms start to brew, and opportunity. And then when the rains come, like a seed that's been planted in dry soil, it sprouts and it grows and it bears its fruit. Sometimes the fruit is good fruit and sometimes it's bad. This provocation for change can come from both the majority and the minority. I think of Tito's Yugoslavia, which was, basically recognized as one nation, and now it's several, Croatia and Serbia and Bosnia. And the end results of European map-making around the world, forcing entire geographies of people to conform to the colonial desires of European power brokers. These are great illustrations of forcing people groups to live together that really aren't unified. Now, if the power structure is strong enough, the seeds of division can be hidden. They can be denied, but left unresolved. But they're there. And when the rain comes, the seeds begin to sprout. The House of Guise had the power, and their time would come. They would move against the enemy, quote unquote, when the time was right, conducive to their convictions. They were not interested in unity with Protestants. The third group of influence would be what I would call the royalists. I think of them as Catholic nationalists. They loved their country and they loved their king. These are the unity guys. Now, these groups are going to develop. We'll see them kind of emerge a little bit later. They're going to be developing over time. As it happened, Francis died in 1547 with his struggle far from over. In fact, the struggle was just getting started. So Francis's son, Henry II, continued the war with Charles V of Spain, and then his son and successor, Philip II, until 1559, when as part of the Treaty of Chateau-Colombrésis, remember we talked about this in the last episode, Henry had been hosting William of Orange and the Duke of Alba during this time. Henry, the guy who ignited William of Orange, remember Philip had sent those hostages as a show of good faith. The exchange here was Henry received the hostages, but he gave his daughter in marriage to Philip. It's a different world that they lived in than we do, right? We're in the middle of signing a peace treaty after fighting a war, and you give me some hostages, and just to make sure that treaty comes out. And by the way, I'll take your daughter so I can marry her. Now, it's an odd thing. Henry would not live to see the fruits of his labor because he died during the wedding festivities by a blow from a lance to his head. It was under Henry's reign that the House of Guise was raised to prominence. Henry was marrying his daughter off to the King of Spain to keep peace. So you begin to see how this is going to start getting messy. So we want to back up just a little bit then. Upon his ascension, Henry took up the mantle that his father Francis had so reluctantly avoided for so long, and that was to root out Protestantism. Thus, his encouragement and acceptance of the House of Guise. Good, strong, devoted Catholics, and by default then anti-Protestant. So the stage was set, and the storm clouds of French society were beginning to move in. In 1551, the Edict of Chateaubriand attempted to cut Protestantism off at the knees. Protestant public worship, even conversations around town or at the workplace were prohibited. The situation had gone from state ambivalence to Protestant antagonism to official suppression. Now, here's just a brief overview of the ensuing years beginning in 1551. Again, many of the power brokers were now Protestants. It would not be that easy to get rid of them. It's kind of like when you put a sign up that says, "Stay off the grass," right? I mean, when I'm in public places, sometimes I think there'd be less people on the grass if you didn't put the sign up. I'm one of these guys, remember, I like order, I like predictability. I stay on the sidewalk. But it seems to me as soon as you put a sign up that says "Stay off the grass," people are inadvertently going to want to go on the grass. I remember some years ago, I went to a museum, Mark Twain's house in Hartford, Connecticut. I went with a friend of mine, and we were taking the tour through the mansion. And, there was a lot of timepieces there, but a lot of the furniture was actually Mark Twain's furniture. They kind of, everything was according to the time frame that he lived. Some of the stuff was actually his, and some of the stuff they had brought in to make it look as close as they could to when he had lived in the mansion. And they had the rooms roped off. I mean, we've all been in those types of museums. And so you have like these center hallways down the rooms, and we're walking through and we're getting the tour. And one of the things that they had said a few times was, please don't touch anything. I mean, 10,000 people a year go through the mansion. If everybody touched the edge of that couch or the hem of the drapes, obviously what would happen to the things that are in the mansion? Well, as the group started leaving one of the rooms and heading up the stairs, it was just myself and my friend left. I noticed that she was lingering back, and I had a feeling she was going to do exactly what she did next. As soon as she recognized that we were the only two people left in the room, she reached out and just with the tip of her finger, she just touched the edge of the couch. For no other reason, frankly, except for the fact that she was told not to. That's human nature. So the Edict of Chateaubriand, which had attempted to cut Protestant off at the knees, in fact, had the opposite effect. It didn't just fail, it beckoned even foreign preachers to come to France and to set up underground churches. Just like what was going on in the Netherlands and Scotland at this time. England had already turned from Catholicism a generation before for a very different set of reasons. And that divorce from the Catholic Church had produced the pro-Protestant or anti-Catholic Queen Elizabeth. England was a powerful nation ruled by a powerful woman. And as we've already discussed, and will continue to discuss in this episode and a couple of others, it was this Elizabeth who had the very public and captivating rivalry with her cousin Mary, Queen of the Scots, who was a Catholic. Now you'll notice Spain proper did not have these problems. They were the leaders of the Counter-Reformation. Philip's tool was the Inquisition, and they squashed rebellion and challenge everywhere they found it. So back in France, Protestant influence and numbers grew despite the Edict of 1551. These underground churches forced the members to form strong associations and alliances, kind of like secret societies. And they grew bolder once again. Now, as with any people anywhere, when popular movements gain momentum, they can be very difficult to suppress. And depending on the level of sophistication and the numbers, can appear dangerous to the status quo. You need organization to accompany zeal, though. Strategy trumps emotion. Very small groups can control the masses. Conversely, mass rioters can be easily put down by a very small, organized group. Remember, the Protestants in France, they were leaders in French society. They knew how to organize, and they were just as determined as their counterparts. When popular uprisings gain momentum, laws are often ignored. Marginalized. Each person becomes the arbiter of good and evil in their own minds. And the masses, if organized, collectively force official recognition and change. Or they must be put down, and that's often by force. We all know this. We're actually working toward a scenario in this series where the power brokers were too slow to address the organized opposition, and they lost. Now, in France, in the middle of the 16th century, The Catholics were simply not going to let go of their power base very easily. Tensions rose. Incidents continued. At the time of Henry's death in 1559, France was on the brink of civil war. Not possibly on the brink of civil war. I mean, they're at the precipice. It's going to happen. It was about to start. As I said earlier, there were actually officially 8 civil wars. I kind of look at it as there's one long civil war with some intermissions. But again, getting back to civil unrest, getting back to a lack of unity when division comes. What's the right response? Is total war the right response? Total destruction of the enemy? Dialogue? Are you supposed to talk through it? I mean, is the answer to that question, what's the right response? Is it situational? The question is, does a culture have a right to defend itself? I mean, and with what data points does it defend itself? Compared to what or to who? I mean, is it really defending itself for its own advancement, or is it the advancement of a narrative, an emotional experience, whether it's real or perceived? Is it personal advancement or collectively? To what extent does your opinion depend on your perspective per topic? Or do you have a dogmatic approach to everything? Do you challenge everything? Do you crush all dissent? How much latitude do you give others? Here's a question. Who owns history? The folks that wrote the history that becomes popular, were they inclusive of the opposition? Winston Churchill once said, and I'm paraphrasing the quote because I don't have it right in front of me, but Winston Churchill said something to the effect, "History will look favorably on me because I shall write it." Does every opinion count? Under what circumstances should one group be admitted to the table and another group omitted? I mean, which is worse, the tyranny of the majority or the tyranny of the minority? They're both tyranny. So is it total war or total capitulation? Is it somewhere in between? When do you take action? Do you show patience and reserve, or do you demonstrate a sense of urgency? Do setbacks increase militancy? What experiences or lessons have you learned in your own life that make you act or react a certain way? I mean, what triggers you? Are you cognizant of what triggers other people? Do you even care? You should. I hear people say all the time, "I don't care what people think of me." I almost wish I could say that, but I can't, and I don't wish I could say that. I do care what people think of me. I care about reputation, testimony, what people think. They may not like me for my opinions, and that's okay, as long as they get the opinion right? So how have your opinions evolved? I mean, what's your reaction in the face of adversity? Most situations are not that important to most people. I mean, we count on that, don't we? For civility and discourse in public. Most people realize that opinions about which brand of fruit or vegetable to purchase are not really that important in the grand scheme of things. So most areas of life are not hills that we need to die on, unless you actually work for a fruit factory. But what happens if a whole culture or a subset draw a conscious conclusion that this idea or that idea is actually that important? They simply will not rest until the status quo is changed, until the sense of normalcy around the issue is inherently changed. What happens when other people in that same society don't come to that conclusion? Maybe they haven't even considered it. Maybe it's as important to them as the question of what fruits or vegetables to buy. They've only lightly considered it. It's of very little importance to them. On most issues, I mean, almost any subject that you're going to come across, but on most issues, most populations have that bell curve effect. Right? The ends are farther away from the middle. These are more of the purists, the devotees of one position or another. They're much less in numbers than the general mass of population, far more devoted to their cause. They're diametrically opposed to the far end of that bell curve. The middle has the largest mass of population, and they're just going with the flow. Depending on the issue, we each find ourselves somewhere along that curve, right? I mean, sometimes I'm on the far right end and sometimes the far left end. Most things, though, I'm kind of in the middle somewhere in that big bump. Oftentimes, the extremes don't focus on the same issues at the same times. And even if they do, the populated middle, that fat part of the bell curve, nullifies the effectiveness of anything that they'd really want to do, right? I mean, The majority of the people, they just simply live and work and move around the extremes, largely controlling the tempo and the degree of influence of either one of those sides. But what happens when the bell curve is turned upside down? What happens when the extreme folks have the numbers? Whether the measuring rod for numbers is power or money or weapons or academia or theology, the national thought police and the moral compass for a people, the folks just trying to get by and the malcontents all living among them, looking so similar until opportunity presents itself. This isn't a judgment call on any particular position. It's not an attempt to assign right or wrong. I mean, it's just a question. What happens when society's bell curve turns upside down? This is what we're working toward. This is what happened in France. This is the process by which things change. Sometimes the process benefits the people. Sometimes it doesn't. The process itself can be uncomfortable. The rabble-rousers, those who want to turn that bell curve upside down, they count on it being uncomfortable. I mean, frankly, for most people, critical analysis simply does not factor into their daily lives. They just get up and they go with the flow. They go to school, they go to work, they play sports. They don't even really pay attention. It's kind of Washington's grazing multitude until things get very shaky in their own daily activities. I mean, when they show up at your door at midnight with pitchforks, it really does not matter who they are. You either fight, you join them, or you perish. I mean, eventually you will pick a side. And all of a sudden, even those content to avoid the struggle are in the struggle. Maybe not even on the side that they would have chosen. In France, as with other areas of Europe, the Reformation caused this kind of social disruption. Reactions varied. I mean, Spain was brutally putting down dissent. So brutal, the papacy was even nervous about the depth of their response. Then the Netherlands enjoyed a lot of liberty, or basically unchecked influence, right? France had a devoted Catholic king that was leery and hesitant to act with too much authority too quickly. I mean, take your pick. What should have been done? The trick to that question is to answer it while considering the world that these folks lived in, not the one that you do. I mean, hypothetically, if you seriously believe that there's another way, a better way, a hill that you've deemed that's worth dying on, to what lengths will you go? Conversely, if you seriously believe a certain direction is unequivocally wrong, presents irreparable damage to a system, to what lengths will you go to prevent it, to root it out? Not just oppose it, but destroy it. This was the growing situation in France. So these civil wars are collectively known as the French Wars of Religion, and they are as serious or more so than anything that we in this generation have ever faced. There are lessons and illustrations for us today, though. These wars were waged from 1562 to 1598 and officially ended with the Edict of Nantes, and that's what we're going to be working toward today. Don't underestimate the destruction of these wars. 2 to 4 million French citizens died at the hands of other French citizens. What does that do to a national psyche? Sun Tzu, the famed Chinese philosopher and strategist, once said that protracted wars deplete the public confidence and the public coffers. Protracted wars deplete the public confidence and public coffers. What happens when the war is domestic? What happens when you fight 36 years of civil wars? Think about France at this time. Recent cultural experiences already included the plague, the 100 Years' War, the Reformation, war with Spain. They're in the middle of the Dutch Revolt, right next door. This is an important period to at least consider. Again, these national memories that are being formed here in the 16th century will be carried into the New World. There's not one, but several intersections between France and Spain and the Netherlands that must be considered. Many of the episodes and events that we're going to discuss in and around English colonial America were seen at the time as, at least in part, religious wars. They're carryovers from the old world, from these specific times. We oftentimes think of like colonial America, they're like our little brothers and sisters in our culture, right? They're not. These people were medieval Europeans. They didn't think the way that we do. The context and the attitude of those folks, just a few decades and generation removed from our study here, were conceived, birthed, and nurtured at this time. And they still have influence today, whether we acknowledge this or not, whether we know it or not. History's like science. It remains constant and reliable whether anyone at all considers it, whether anyone at all understands it, whether anyone at all employs it. History's like an older relative. It can teach us many things from experience. So when Henry passed from the scene in 1559, his wife, Catherine de' Medici, became very active in French politics. And it's interesting at this point in time to think about this time frame in France through her perspective, or at least letting her actions kind of help drive the narrative. She's going to have over a decade of direct influence. And she also played a pivotal role in one of the most pivotal events in all of the times, and that is saying something. I mean, just considering what we've already discussed. Catherine's a fascinating woman in her own right. She birthed 10 children. You think about that, ouch. I mean, I'm not even a woman, and I think, ouch. I mean, how did that happen again? I remember when my wife was pregnant with our third child. One of my friends, when I told him that we were going to have another baby, he looked at me and he got very serious. And I thought he was going to tell me something profound. And he said, dude, do you need me to get you a book to let you know how that keeps happening? Catherine had 10 children. Let that sink in. It's like almost a decade of pregnancy. Not only had she been married to the king, she would see 3 of her sons sit on the throne. She would help shape policy. One of her daughters got married to another future king. And through all of this, Catherine had to contend with the House of Guise, who was made prominent actually by her husband, for control of the French throne. Catherine tried to thread the needle between the Catholic and the Protestant conflicts. She was very shrewd. The First War of Religion began in 1562, 3 years after Henry's death. After the death of Henry II, his son, Francis II, Catherine's son, reigned, but he died after only 1 year. So next up was 10-year-old Charles IX, with Catherine steering the ship. By 1570, Catherine had begun to actively quell the rivalry between the Catholics and the Protestants. That's not an easy job. I mean, she's keeping the peace. She's trying to raise a king. She's holding back the powerful House of Guise. These are Catholics that are intent on having her son's throne. Catherine's plan was to marry her daughter Margaret to another Henry. A lot of Henrys in this story. Henry of Navarre was an influential young man with a very bright future. He was not Catholic, however. He was a Huguenot, greatly influenced and mentored by Gaspard de Coligny, whose daughter, Louise, would one day marry William of Orange. Now, de Coligny was a powerful man in his own right, and a Huguenot. He was not at all popular with the House of Guise or with Philip of Spain. Gaspard de Coligny was also enjoying influence with another young Frenchman, the young king himself, Charles IX. Charles is older now and coming into his own, and he was breaking away from his mother's guidance and accepting more and more of Gaspard de Coligny's. One of the areas of influence was what to do, if anything, about the Protestant revolt in the Netherlands. Coligny was pushing for alliances with the Dutch Protestants. You see where this is going. You remember that the Dutch were actively seeking French assistance. And in de Coligny, they found a friend. What it comes down to at this point is religious affiliation versus national interest. So imagine that. Decades of turmoil had come down to this. An influential Protestant was not only becoming a valued counselor to the young ruler, but also to the heir apparent. Now ask yourself, from a Catholic perspective, outside of the royal family, or maybe even within it, would that be a welcome scenario? Thus the soapbox a little while ago. This is not such a cut and dry situation. You see how shrewd Catherine is. She's trying to appease everybody at once and maintain the throne for her own son. and it was at this time that yet another war with Spain looked imminent. Catherine desperately wanted to avoid this. Her preoccupation was French. It wasn't Spanish, and it wasn't Dutch. Who do you appease in this situation? How do you avoid war, protect the throne, and maintain your own power base? Now, it's supposed Catherine's solution of appeasement on all fronts was to assassinate Gaspard di Coligny. It was really a combined effort with her frenemies at the House of Guise. Now, this is why I think she was so shrewd. She knew that she would appease the House of Guise and Philip II and suppress Protestantism by denying them one of their greatest leaders, also protecting her son's throne. The plan was hatched. It would take place at the wedding of Henry Navarre and Margaret. It happens to be Catherine's daughter, Charles's sister. Remember, this marriage was arranged as part of a plan to help calm the divisions between Catholic and Protestant, originally, right? So you've got Catholics and Protestants going at each other in France. Catherine figures if we marry a prominent Protestant to my daughter, that may quell some of those divides, but now we've got to worry about the Catholic problem. You see the irony? Calming national divisions through a wedding and then smoothing international divisions through deception and butchery. Just as long as everything goes smoothly and nobody finds out about the assassination plan of Gaspard di Coligny, everything's going to go well. As long as no one finds out, it's a totally inside job. So the wedding celebration would take place in Paris in August of 1572. Many Huguenots would be in attendance, not just de Coligny, but most of the Huguenot leadership, and a rumored army not far away, possibly up to 4,000 men. This possibility of that much Huguenot power so close may have helped to perpetuate the disaster that was coming. This disaster is remembered as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The original plot failed. De Coligny was wounded, but he lived. But because he lived, panic began to set in. One fear was that the plot, and worse yet, the plotters, would be found out. So not just that this was a planned attack, but, can you imagine it's like the royal family that planned this? So they immediately enlarged the plot to include as many Huguenots as possible. After all, they're all in Paris right now. Many important people were there. And it was hoped that this would avoid possible retaliatory action. If they're all dead, they can't retaliate. Charles is taking counsel of de Coligny. Imagine how that conversation went. Reluctantly, he sanctioned the larger act. He always regretted it later. That's nice. So the assailants would be the Duke of Guise with his men, who would kill Coligny, and the King's Swiss Guard, who would be given a list of Huguenots to hunt down and kill. After the leadership was killed and word spread, so did the terror throughout Paris and across the country. That uneasy division that can exist just below the surface, unseen, maybe even unknown until opportunity strikes. Like the riots and mayhem that we often see in the midst of some natural disaster. That's what happened. Huguenot homes and businesses were destroyed. Looting was rampant. In the end, about 3,000 Parisians and tens of thousands of Huguenots across the country were killed. Later, their murderers were granted immunity. I want to read a couple of shorter articles I pulled up just to kind of solidify this thought process. And again, we're going to see in here, actually. We'll wait till we get to this particular point. The first thing I want to read is from the August 24th, 2015 edition of the Tudor Chronicles. And if you'll excuse me, this is kind of a little bit of a larger quote, a larger read, is a few paragraphs, but I think it's important that we underscore what I've just been talking about. On the 24th of August, 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre took place in France during the French Wars of Religion, which was a period of civil infighting and military operations fought between the French Catholics and the Huguenots, Calvinist Protestants. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny was the leader of the Huguenots and was considered dangerous by Catherine de' Medici, the king's mother. She believed that de Coligny was gaining too much power, especially as he was pursuing an alliance with the English and the Dutch Protestant rebels. The king's sister, Margaret of France, who was a Catholic, was set to marry the Protestant Henry of Navarre on the 18th of August, 1572. and de Coligny and other nobles arrived in Paris for the wedding. The wedding attracted a large number of Huguenots to the largely Catholic Paris. And just 4 days later, on the 22nd of August, there was a failed assassination attempt on de Coligny when he was shot at on the streets of Paris. Although it was never discovered who ordered the attempt on de Coligny's life, it is widely believed to be Catherine de' Medici, who believed that de Coligny was becoming influential over the king. A decision was made to close the gates to the city and arm the citizens of Paris to stop any Protestant uprising. The king's Swiss guard was provided with a list of prominent Protestants to kill. As the bells for matins between midnight and dawn rang out, the Swiss guards evicted any Protestant nobles from the Louvre castle and massacred them in the street. Meanwhile, the Duke of Guise led a group of supporters, killed de Coligny in his lodgings along with several of his men on the 24th of August. De Coligny's body was then thrown out of the window, where it was castrated, mutilated, dragged through the mud, thrown in the river, suspended on a gallows, and then burned by the crowd. Now, just stop for 1 second. Think about the fear going through the minds of the Protestants at this time. Think about how quickly this all happened. Think about, they didn't have streetlights back then. Think about hearing the noise in the dark. And think about just today, you may have been in the bakery buying a loaf of bread, standing next to your neighbor, having a conversation about the weather, or maybe the wedding that was in town. And that same neighbor now is running down the streets butchering any Protestant that they can find. So back to the article then. Quote, as a result of de Coligny's assassination, the city's Catholics began murdering Protestants and looting their homes. You remember I was talking about just that undertow of unsettling disunity that can exist. Sometimes we don't even know it's there. The article continues, the bodies of those killed were loaded onto carts and disposed of in the Seine River. The revolt lasted 3 days despite attempts by the king to stop it. Now this next sentence kills me. On the 26th of August, the king and his court established an official version of events. An official version. So it must have been worse than this. You think they made it worse? They cleaned it up as much as they could. They probably wrote down only the things they couldn't deny. It's amazing. And again, from just a slightly different account, this comes from a website that I found, ThoughtCo, and this is by Heather Michon, M-I-C-H-O-N. And this was recently updated January 14th, 2020. And again, I just want to encapsulate a little bit about what actually happened at the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Quote, it came at the end of a week of celebration and feasting in Paris as King Charles IX hosted the wedding of his sister Margaret to Prince Henry of Navarre. The marriage of the Catholic princess to a Protestant prince was designed in part to heal divisions between Catholics and the Protestant minority in France. But in the early morning hours of August 24th, just 4 days after the wedding and on the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day, French troops marched into Protestant neighborhoods shouting, "Kill them all." A little farther down in the article, quote, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a nobleman who had led Huguenot troops in the late war, became friendly with Charles IX in the years following the Peace of Saint-Germain, much to the dismay of the king's formidable mother, Catherine de' Medici, and the anti-Huguenot faction led by the powerful Guise family. Charles, at just 22 years old, was easily swayed by those around him, and there was considerable fear that the formidable 55-year-old de Coligny would use the impressionable young king to advance the Huguenot cause. As the royal wedding approached in the summer of 1572, de Coligny proposed that Charles lead a joint Catholic Huguenot action to support Protestants fighting the Spaniards in the Netherlands. It's not clear when Catherine de' Medici and the Guises determined Coligny needed to be removed, but by the morning of August 22nd, there was a plan in place. That morning, Coligny attended a meeting of the Royal Council at the Louvre and left with his bodyguards at around 11 a.m. On his way back to his room, an assassin jumped out of an alley and shot Coligny in the arm. Charles rushed to his side. The wound to his arm was not mortal, but the admiral was bedridden and in severe pain. Once back at the palace, Catherine and her faction began to pressure the young king to take dramatic action to prevent a Huguenot uprising. At a royal council meeting the next day, the members were absorbed with fear that the Huguenots within the city would launch a retaliatory attack. And there were also rumors of a 4,000-strong Huguenot army just outside the city walls. Adding to the pressure, Catherine spent hours alone with her son, urging him to order a strike against the Huguenots. Unable to withstand the pressure, Charles finally gave the order to kill the Huguenot leadership. The attack, led by the Duke of Guise and 100 Swiss guards, was to begin around dawn the next day, St. Bartholomew's Day. The article continues, Coligny was among the first to die. Swiss guards pulled him from his sickbed and slashed at him with axes before throwing his body out the window into the courtyard below. His head was cut off and taken to the Louvre to prove the deed was done. But the killing didn't stop there. Soldiers, quote, all went with their men from house to house wherever they thought they might find Huguenots, breaking down the doors and then cruelly massacring those that they encountered without regard to sex or age. Catholic Parisians, possibly urged on by militant priests, soon joined in the slaughter. Mobs began targeting Huguenot neighbors, trying to force them to renounce their heresy and murdering them when they refused. Many tried to escape, only to find the city's gates closed against them. The mass slaughter went on for 3 days and stopped only when most of the Huguenots in the city were exterminated. Imagine the fear. Imagine if that happened. We can only imagine because most people, probably almost everybody that's ever going to hear this, has never actually experienced a situation like this. The article continues, quote, carts piled high with the dead bodies of noble ladies, women, girls, men, and boys were brought down and emptied into the river, which was covered with dead bodies and ran red with blood. As news of the killings in Paris spread across France, you would hope that cooler minds would prevail, right? So did the violence. From late August to October, Catholics rose up and launched massacres against Huguenots in many French cities. How many were killed in these massacres has been debated for almost 450 years. Most historians believe around 3,000 were killed in Paris and perhaps 10,000 nationwide. Others believe that it might have been between 20 and 30,000. And in all honesty, most of the reports that I've read lean closer to that 30,000 mark. A large number of Huguenot survivors likely converted back to Catholicism for their own protection. Many others immigrated to Protestant strongholds outside of France. Now, they lived in a different time than we do. So the article continues, if you'll indulge me just a little bit more. Quote, however unplanned it may have been, Catholics across Europe viewed the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre as a great victory for the Church. At the Vatican, the killings were celebrated by Pope Gregory XIII with special masses of thanksgiving and a commemorative metal coin with the inscription, and I'll translate, Slaughter of the Huguenots, 1572. In Spain, King Philip was said to have laughed for one of the only times in memory upon hearing of this news. Interesting times, aren't they? Just below the surface of an organized, unified society can lie divisions that we can only imagine. Now, in the end, Henry Navarre himself was spared only through a combination of imprisonment and a false claim of conversion to Catholicism. Henry Navarre married the king's sister and was promptly imprisoned for 4 years. The year that he escaped and recanted his conversion was 1576. You wonder what he thought about for 4 years. I mean, how did that marriage been going? Did he have conjugal visits? I don't know. I mean, I don't think they kept him in a cell the whole time, but he was imprisoned. They would be very awkward at family functions and holidays. Oh, the holidays. Now, meanwhile, 2 years after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1574, while Henry was still captive, Charles died. And his brother, get this, another Henry, Henry III, ascended to the throne. He was the third son of Catherine and Francis I to sit on the French throne, and he would rule until 1589, 15 years. He represents the last of the Valois dynasty. Now, Henry III's an interesting guy. He was smart enough to diminish Catherine's role after 15 years of authority. He courted the Protestants and he relaxed a lot of hostilities. He was strong enough to pacify Catherine. Actually, he was very strong. He assassinated several of his key enemies within France. In 1588, he took out several leaders within the House of Guise. Now remember, these guys had real power. They just weren't on the throne, but they were powerful, and they had powerful friends and backers like Philip II of Spain. Henry's actions provoked an extreme response from the extreme Catholics, and he was also strong enough and had the backbone to withstand what came next. In response to his policies, the House of Guise, competitors to his throne, those that were empowered by his father years earlier, formed the Holy League. Though it was supported domestically by the House of Guise, it was actually financed and supported internationally by Philip of Spain. So again, back to our soapbox discussion a little while ago. Does that constitute collusion? The direct meddling in a foreign government's affairs? There's nothing new under the sun. Emotions and convictions in those days and throughout history run high. I mean, you can just hear the quotes of people justifying these things. It's for the good of the country. The ends justifies the means. Remember the song the lyrics that I read earlier from Charlie Daniels, In America. Remember Charlie Daniels wrote, "You outside people best leave us alone." What's your position politically on that? The interference or the meddling of outside governments. I'll bet you your opinion is far more situational than you think it is. It's amazing how quickly things can escalate, how the proverbial enemy of my enemy is my friend. Henry III inherited many factional enemies, those who wanted his throne. And he forged an international alliance with their enemies, those who logically should have been his enemies. Does that make sense? Henry's a Catholic, king of a Catholic country. He ought to be getting along with the Catholics. But he's got tension with Philip of Spain, and he's got the House of Guise in his own country, and he's got the Holy League. So Henry III forged an alliance with Henry Navarre, his brother-in-law, who had been in prison for 4 years after his wedding. And here's a spoiler alert. Henry Navarre would become he was the future king of France. This is the guy whose wedding had sparked the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. This is Henry's successor, the one who would establish the House of Bourbon. He would become Henry IV. He's a Huguenot, but he's a countryman. He's a Frenchman. What's a patriot? I mean, by definition, a patriot by definition is not one who goes along to get along, but rather one who loves his country and, if called, serves. Do you agree with that definition? A patriot is not one who goes along to get along, but rather one who loves his country and, if called, serves. I'll leave you to define what service is in your own mind. Imagine how this scenario would play out in today's 24-hour news cycle. I mean, I don't even know which channel would be on which side, to be honest with you. So Henry Navarre was a Protestant, and he was not a Valois. He signaled the death of that royal line, and he established the House of Bourbon in 1589. This was a powerful house. This was a house that would rule France until the Revolution in 1789. And again, a couple of kings after France survived their own revolution. In 1700, it was a Bourbon, Philip V, that assumed the throne of Spain. And their rule and influence continued in Spain until 1931. And they reassumed the throne again in 1975 when Juan Carlos I became the King of Spain. The Bourbons have a powerful and lasting legacy. I mean, I don't care who you are. That's impressive. These people are like the Romanov lights or something, right? I mean, they took control and they ruled and ruled and ruled. So once Henry III allied with the future Henry IV, France was essentially split three ways, politically and ecclesiastically. First, you've got Henry III. And again, these are my definitions loosely. I don't think that they're incorrect. But the way I see it is he's supported by kind of the royalists, Catholic nationalists. And then you've got the Holy League, led by Henry Lorraine, the Duke of Guise, and supported by Philip II of Spain. And thirdly, you've got Henry Navarre, the Huguenot, Protestant. the challenge to papal authority, a man who could have had massive impact on the affairs of other European nations, a man that was capable of truly shifting the paradigm. So at the end of the day, what remained of decades of competition was basically the House of Bourbon versus the House of Guise. The House of Bourbon won that fight upon Henry's death in 1589. Notice this wasn't a hereditary transfer, regardless of it's going from Henry II to Henry III or Henry III to Henry IV, actually. And because of this, Henry was not recognized for many years. 4 years later, in 1593, Henry Navarre, now Henry IV, officially converted to Catholicism. And he did not recant his conversion this time. Henry IV was good for France. He calmed the decades of tension between Protestant and Catholic. He was popular and he was good for the economy. And in 1598, the Edict of Nantes officially ended the wars of religion. France was officially Catholic and officially at peace internally. The implications to come in the New World would be significant. Although France had had no real official involvement or influence in the Dutch Netherlands' quest for independence because of her own internal struggles at the time, it may be precisely why the Dutch succeeded. And we'll consider their participation next time. And again, I do hope that you come back.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.